Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Carolyn Evans. I'm the Vice Chancellor of Griffith University, and it is a delight to be welcoming you here tonight. I begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Turrbal and the Agra people. I respect their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to Indigenous people who are joining us here tonight, and recognise, as we're talking about perspectives on Asia, that we have had, in fact, quite fruitful discussions, debates and trade between the peoples of Australia and the peoples of Asia over a very long period indeed. Can I acknowledge the Consul General of Japan, the Deputy Consul General of China and the former Consul General of the Netherlands who are joining us tonight? And could I also welcome the many friends, I think many long-term friends of this series, but also anybody who might be joining us for the first time. It gives me great pleasure here tonight to be at the second Perspectives of Asia seminar for 2025. It is, however, the 116th lecture for this series. It marks the 20th anniversary of the Perspectives Asia series. Now, that series was, as the mathematically inclined among you will know, launched in 2005, and it's been organised as a collaborative platform between two absolutely wonderful Queensland institutions, the Griffith Asia Institute from Griffith University and the Australian Centre of Asia Pacific Art from QAGOMA. The series was established by former director Michael Wesley, who we're delighted could be here with us tonight, and Doug Hall, along with then curatorial manager Sahanya Raphael, who wanted to provide a platform for discussion and debate about Australia's relationship with its regional neighbours. And if you have an opportunity to have a look at this fabulous little publication that just gives an overview of the last 20 years, you will see we've had an extraordinary mix of speakers, the good, the great, the highly informed, sometimes all three at the same time. We've taken on topics that have ranged from sport to culture, from pandemics to diplomacy, and then prepared to take on some of the controversial topics of the day, always bringing expert insight, and I know that tonight will be no exception. We have great pleasure in thanking our seminar partner, and particular Director Chris Saines and all of his staff, past and present, who've contributed to the success of this series. I want to acknowledge the staff of both the Griffith Asia Institute and QAGOMA. It is no small thing to have a series like this continue over such an extended period of time. Many people start these sorts of ideas and they last for a year or two, provide a wonderful role, but the relationship peters out. It's wonderful, and it's particularly wonderful because Griffith and QAGOMA have such a deep relationship on so many levels. Tonight's event lives the tradition of Perspectives Asia. It will bring a temporal perspective on the past 20 years, the present, and indeed take us into the future, and different perspectives on Asia, bridging, among others, culture, diplomacy and economics. As we look before us today, we have two former and one current directors of GAI, one of the first speakers that we had in this series, and of course it's wonderful to have Chris here as well. I now hand over to a former Griffith Asia Institute director, my good colleague, Professor Caitlin Byrne.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here to mark this really special occasion. I have to say it is genuinely a pleasure. I think I'm in my happy place. So it's really lovely to be here. It's so good to see a full house. So thank you all for also joining us this evening. So Perspectives Asia, I think, as the Vice-Chancellor has already mentioned, is really a beloved part of the work that Griffith Asia Institute and I think the work that QAGOMA has been engaged in for the last 20 years. It's really fabulous to have seen the wide contours that have been traversed through the conversations in this room and the people who have sat here to talk about the strategic dynamics of our region, the Asia-Pacific region, and to reflect on Australia's role in that region. So I think tonight will be no exception. We are joined by four fabulous panellists. I'm not going to read bios, but I will just give you titles. And I think you'll know none of these speakers are strangers to this stage either. What I wanted to do tonight, though, was really, again, work through three kind of stages in the Perspectives Asia landscape. To begin, I'd like to talk, and I'm really thinking about these as three acts, if you like. I'd like to talk about the origin story, the foundations and fractures, and I think thinking about Perspectives Asia as having emerged during a time when political, social, economic and cultural forces were shaping a new kind of vision for Australia in the Asia Pacific. And my opening question will go to you, Michael, perhaps fittingly, as the founding director of the Griffith Asia Institute and really being part of the vision of this series. When the series was launched in 2005, Australia was navigating the Howard years. China had joined the WTO. We were also living in a post-9/11 world with security concerns really at the forefront of many nations' agendas. And the region itself was changing. In the decade to follow, you reflected and you wrote on a number of these themes. The Howard Paradox, Australian Diplomacy in Asia in 2007. There Goes the Neighbourhood, Australia and the Rise of Asia in 2011. And Restless Continent, Wealth Rivalries and the Rise of Asia in 2015. There were some common threads through all of those works. And I guess without asking you to summarise all of those, I'd like you to reflect perhaps on those big themes. I know you brought a fairly hard-edged realist view to the way that you were thinking about Australia's place in the region and the conversations at the time. But what was it that motivated you to embark on a partnership with a cultural institution in Brisbane to start a dialogue about Asia and our perspectives on it?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Well, 2005, I had come back to Brisbane. I'd gone to university here at UQ and grown up north of here. And coming back to Brisbane was an important kind of experience for my family and I. And for the first time, I was sort of in charge of this sort of university think tank, if you like. And I was also very conscious of the fact that Australia's sort of odyssey in Asia was shifting and was shifting in important ways. I had sort of come of age at a time sort of intellectually when the Hawke Keating, Gareth Evans sort of approach to Asia and Asia was in the late 80s, early 90s, almost like a spiritual quest, a holy grail. And when you go back to reports like Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy, the Roscano report, there was this sense that Asia was a way for Australia to become wealthy, powerful, successful, but it was also a way for Australia to throw off its sort of colonial cringe, if you like, its constant genuflection to Europe and the United States. And so that was the sense of Asia was almost like a holy grail type thing. And then you had the election of John Howard in 1996, and it completely shifted. Howard came to office saying, the Labor vision is completely wrong. Yes, Asia is important, but we don't actually have to change to be successful in Asia. In fact, we will be accepted because we are economically important to Asia and Asia is economically important to us. And so in 2005, I was very, very aware that Australia's Asian odyssey, if you like, had become highly materialistic and highly pragmatic. And I still remember walking outside of this building didn't exist in 2005, but outside of the Queensland Art Gallery with Sahanya, having had lunch, and we were talking about the fact that the kind of identity, intellectual, cultural elements of our Asian odyssey had been completely buried by the Howard government. And so the idea of Perspectives Asia was really about what non-material elements can the Griffith Asia Institute and the Queensland Art Gallery together start to foreground again. Because, one last thing I'll say before I stop. Between 1990 and 2005, one of the big changes is that Australian society had started to Asianise itself. So many people of Asian background, like Sahanya and myself, had become part of Australian society. And so really the founding kind of inspiration of Perspectives Asia is let's put the cultural richness back into Australia's Asian Odyssey.
Thank you. I think we're going to come back to some of those themes because I wonder, they cycle through at different points. And I should have mentioned, Michael, you are Deputy Vice Chancellor, Global Culture and Engagement for the University of Melbourne. I love the title. I'm glad my boss is here. We talk about that title. It's such a nice one. I still think, as I remember when I met you, just after I'd taken on the role of Director, Griffith Asia Institute, you did say to me, that period of my life was like bliss. And I think there is something
really
about that.
Yeah.
That, Christoph, I hope you are experiencing as well. But Chris, I wonder if I can come to you now because you weren't here for the 2005 lecture, but you have been stewarding QAGOMA now through multiple political cycles. You've seen numerous APTs, for example, Asia-Pacific triennials, go through this place. And you have talked about the role that galleries and cultural institutions play in providing spaces for drawing out shared meaning, creating profound moments of connection and understanding, while also celebrating difference. But I do want to come back to the very first Asia Perspectives lecture that was delivered on the 21st of July 2005 by Doug Hall AM, who was then the director of the Queensland Art Gallery, on the role of culture in Australia-Asia relations. Really keen for you to reflect on what that speech might have meant for this institution at that time and perhaps also for this city at that time.
Thanks, Caitlin. I wish I was there, but I've read a little summary of the conversation that was had with Michael after Doug's lecture. And they were talking about the very things I have to say we continue to talk about 20 years on. And that is the role that art museums, art institutions can play in taking culture out into the world in which we live and work. And we live in an Asian neighbourhood. This was something that at the founding of the APT, and I was here for that as a number of my colleagues were, it was a time of immense sort of excitement, but also a leap into a great unknown. And frankly, the reward wasn't that great for effort in 93. Yeah. We did so much to bring it together and not a lot of people saw it. Even in the then sort of attendance records of the time, it was still a fairly low sort of visibility show, but it really suddenly came to mean something. And I know that many people from Melbourne and Sydney, and that's how we judged ourselves then. We don't now, but that is exactly how we judged. Oh, that came up from Sydney, it must be good. And it was one of those things that thinking back to, it didn't come out of nowhere. And I think I can channel a bit of Doug here because I worked with him for a long time. And these conversations were not uncommon back then, that we started forming corporate partnerships with Japanese companies that were then the really big companies on the real estate, particularly the mining real estate of Queensland. And what do they want to do? They wanted to talk about culture. So they offered things like exchanges. So we did an exchange in 84 and then 86 again. We brought a show from the Saitama Museum of Art and we took a show back to the Saitama Museum of Art with which I was involved. And what was amazing about those two shows is all of a sudden we were exporting our own cultural production, Australian artist show called Painters and Sculptors, Diversity in Australian Art. Well, not a lot of people were talking about diversity necessarily back then in the 80s, but that's what the show was. It was the 90s, pardon me. And it was one of those things that eventually the APT began to crystallise around, particularly this formative relationship we were developing with Japan. And I remember something Doug said back then, which has always stayed with me, and I don't think I've kind of thought about it for a long time, till this event prompted me. He said, I met many museum directors in America who said, we have a lot of Asian art, but it all stops dead at 1930.
Right.
And I thought, my God, there's the remit. If we don't want to be like every other museum in the country, doing every other thing that they're doing, but a little bit less well or maybe better in some spaces, this was a big opening into which we could walk. And that's exactly what happened. And when the APT took off, it was meant to go for 3 editions. We just passed 11.
Wow.
But the government of the day wanted just to give it a leash to make sure that it could be pulled back if it didn't all work out. But it succeeded beyond anyone's imagination, even I think its founders' imagination. And we had great people like Claire Roberts and Nick Jose, cultural attaché in the Beijing embassy. We were dealing with a lot of people that were living and working in Asia and bringing what they knew about it. Artists like Pat Hoffey is a good example of that. Alison Carroll of AsiaLink at the time, who was an absolute gun director of AsiaLink. I'm sorry so many of the good things that were done back then are not done today, because what Michael spoke about when talking about that transition from the Hawke-Keating, Asia's our neighbourhood, let's live in it and let's work in it and let's exchange with it and let's grow from that experience. That all kind of did come to a bit of a shuddering halt around the APT 2 and 3 period. And we've never really got off the mat, in my opinion, but I'll return to that theme later, on the cultural diplomacy context in which we're talking tonight.
And if I can just give a shout out, we've got fabulous members from the APT team. Tarun, I'm looking at you, but also, and Simon, I know I've heard from your stories of those early days of scouting out art across the region, and there are a lot of stories we can revisit in thinking about the APT as well. And you've really given us a segue again into this cultural discourse. And this is where I cue you, Julianne, Professor Emeritus, founding editor for the Griffith Review. So, Julianne, as editor for the Griffith Review, I know you've been part of shaping Australia's cultural discourse about our place in the region for a number of years, and you have been a collaborator in the Perspective Asia conversations. I have one of the editions of the Griffith Review. You moderated, so New Asia Now, many in the audience might remember that one, issue 49. You moderated a discussion, a panel discussion for the launch of that issue. And you brought together 3 writers from around the region, Murong Shweshun, Joshua Ip and Maggie Tiojakan. That was an interesting conversation because you were, often in these discussions, we are looking out at the region. You were bringing observations from the region in. Yeah. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. Why was that important?
Oh, look, it was a terrific experience, that whole edition. We called it New Asia Now, and what we did was to get writers from the 39 countries in Asia. So they don't necessarily think of themselves as one block. And one of the things that we were really keen to do was to get some of the diversity of life and experience in those many countries. But we restricted it to writers who were born since 1970, because after 1970, many of the countries in Asia changed profoundly. That was the sort of break point. It was the end of colonisation in many countries. It was the end of autocracies in other countries. It was the beginning of the end of civil wars. It was it's a hugely important moment across many different countries in many different ways. And what we wanted to do with that edition was to highlight some of the dynamism of what was going on in those countries, but also to provide a platform that introduced those writers to each other. Because, just as we don't necessarily have any sort of granular experience or understanding of what might be happening in Indonesia, for instance, similarly across the region, there's not necessarily that sort of exchange. And so what we wanted to do with this edition was to create an opportunity for that sort of exchange. And so we did it collaboratively. Well, we did it, but then the Asia Literary Review also published the whole edition. So that reached out to their networks all around the country. So that particular event that you we did with the Asia, we did here. So Murong is a Chinese writer who has since taken exile from China and is now resident in Australia. Maggie was then a young Indonesian journalist who had she got caught, I'm getting the dates of this, but she got caught up in the early days of the Trump stuff of people being kicked out and not being able to come back. She was Muslim. And who was the third person? It was
Joshua
Ip.
Yeah.
So Joshua Ip was at that stage still a member of the military in Singapore, but he was the poet on the side, and he was waiting to retire. I mean, at 39, as you could in Singapore at the time, to become a full-time poet and literary activist. So these three people, and I should have said Maggie has since gone on to be the managing director of the Jakarta Post. Yeah. So there were three people who've actually, really were coming into their own, and it was just this amazing experience to bring them here and hear their exchange from their very different experiences and find the points of overlap and collaboration. And exposing that to an Australian audience, I think, was really important in terms of, a bit like APT, that you get some sort of granularity of, like, Asia is not an amorphous block. It's actually, there's a really hugely dynamic sort of set of different societies with different issues and people approaching them in very different ways. So that was sort of the ambition. And we had enormous support for that edition. We had support from DFAT, we had support from the China-Australia Council, a whole bunch of different national organisations, the Australia Council. And we must have toured, I think, about 15 of the writers from that edition. We did events all over the country, and I think it was quite transformative, And when I look back at it now, I think, I'm not saying this about me or anything, it's about the change in the times. I can't imagine that happening. I can't imagine that sort of level of dynamic conversation happening to the same degree with that degree of intense public engagement in the way that wasn't actually exceptional at the time. It just was sort of part of the thing. If we're going to deal with Asia, we're going to be part of Asia. Well, what does that mean? How do we get beyond just the trading and defence stuff to where the real human interaction happens?
And that's a really nice point for me to just reflect on a comment that another person who's been an incredible participant and contributor to this series, Professor Ian Hall, who I think is in the audience. There he is. Ian, I had asked Ian, and many of you would know, which was his favourite Perspectives Asia. And one, of course, was Siobhan Hunu's Photo Diary of India, for those that know Ian as an expert of South Asia politics and international thought. That makes sense. But the one that stands out is the one with Lee Mingwei, an incredibly charismatic man. And I apologise, Ian, I didn't tell you I was going to quote you. Whose art is exquisite, but I was fascinated by his discussion of the unexpected effects of his participatory art and his fascination for all the ways his work affects people and makes them think or laugh or recoil or simply jump. There was something very human and humanist about it all, drawing out things we all share, regardless of where we come from, and displaying such interest and care for others. So I just wanted to put that there and ask for any reflections from any of our panellists, except Christoph, because I'm coming to you next. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that we, delve into that more humanist side of the conversation? And does it make a big difference in the end?
I think it does. I think that what the arts can bring, what cultural presenters can bring to this framework is something that is allowing us to see the world differently. If you're dealing with trade and economics and diplomacy and so on, politics, I guess they have their own sectors of expertise and experience as well. But I feel with artists, you're going to see the world through a completely unexpected and different lens. And that's exactly what I think, having heard Lee Mingwei speak a number of times, that is exactly what you would come to expect from him. He makes such economically simple works, but they move you so profoundly when you experience them. He causes you to write a letter to yourself and send it, and it eventually does get sent by him and appears in a Buddhist monastery in the far distance and is burned and disappears into the ether. And that reminds me of artists in APT1, Dadan Cristanto's amazing work, for those who have died, for those who have lost, etc. It's a beautiful, long, poetic title. I think a few of us here will remember it very profoundly. And we reprised that work 10 years after the APT, when I just arrived back at the gallery, and I was reminded of the way in which I had never experienced an artwork till that point in my life, where people would record private messages of what this particular loss of this person had meant to them. And they weren't writing it to a survivor or a partner, they were writing it for themselves to that person, which doesn't seem a very Western thing to do. And so that's what artists can bring, a very different way of framing and seeing experience of the world. And that's why I think it's such an important part of what this group considers, or what the Perspectives Asia considers.
Julianne, Michael, anything to add?
I am intrigued by that question, because I think my feeling is that we now live in such a world of deals, that sort of deeper sense of meaning and belonging and attachment and how you make sense of it is just continuously papered over. And so you actually, more so than probably ever, have to make the space for that, that moment of reflection, that thing which draws the A to the Z, and you find you've created something else in the middle. I mean, there is almost nothing in our lived experience these days that encourages you to do that. So places like this, and just, quickly looking through that exhibition today, I mean, you realise the depth of material and the, wonderful stuff that has been collected here through the APT stuff, especially over those 33 years or so. And I said to Michael, I can't think of any other gallery in Australia which would have that depth of material, so readily accessible to an audience. And I mean, it's sort of, I always find it interesting in a Queensland context, because, I think as Chris mentioned, the early, for all the, the ghastliness of the Joh Bjelke-Petersen years, which we constantly reflect on. I mean, the other thing that was happening was this sort of really active engagement with Asia. I mean, the opening up of mining and so on, especially and real estate, especially to Japanese corporations. There was, one of my lasting memories is going to Cairns at the time that Japanese people were flying to Cairns to go golfing for the weekend. It doesn't happen, but, there was just this really intense involvement. I mean, I was at school in Brisbane in the early 70s, and we had an active exchange student program with kids from Japan. We had kids from Japan coming. We were going there. There was a sense of, I guess because of geography as much as anything, that despite the sort of the war stuff and the Brisbane line and all of that sort of thing, there was a sense of proximity that connected Queensland to the region in a way that I don't think was, as maybe in WA it was, but I don't think it was as tangible in other states. And so, it doesn't surprise me that you then get something like this happening here, because it's sort of been in the ether, for actually, and you go back further, very long way back, So like the Japanese house in New Farm, and the stuff that was told to the Chinese community in Cairns that Federation would make their life more comfortable. There's been a sort of Queensland is a place of many subcurrents, and I think the subcurrents of engagement with many different countries in Asia is there in a very tangible sort of way.
Thank you. Anything to add there, Michael?
I'll just say a couple of things. Firstly, I think if you deal with others transactionally, you'll be dealt with transactionally back. And that is something that I think we are starting to realise now. I think we're starting to reap the decades that we dealt with our Asian neighbours transactionally. And we're coming to see that, and we've got no answers to it. The other thing is that I would say is Australia is the new arrival here. As post-settlement Australia is the new society in this part of the world, and the other societies in this part of the world have millennia of experience of dealing with each other. And so one of the things that I think is an undercurrent in this series is actually listening to our neighbours. Not talking to them, not talking at them, but listening to them.
So that's where, Christoph, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. This is Act 2, folks. And I have just realised that I've come up here without a clock, so we could talk for hours. But we won't do that, and I'm going to look at you, Kelsey, to make sure we leave a little bit of time for some questions. Thank you. Christoph, you arrived to the Griffith Asia Institute, new to Australia, trying to navigate your way through this landscape, and you're also given the wonderful job of coordinating and curating the Perspectives Asia series with our colleagues here from the gallery. Tell me what that has been like for you, not just in a professional sense, but also personally, as someone who has come from outside Australia to come in and also look at these subcurrents and the contours of Australia's engagement with a region you know very well.
Thank you. That's a big question. Should have prepared for that.
You're the only act in Act 2, by the way. You're the only question in Act 2.
I think just to kind of also tie it in with what we just discussed, why culture remains important. I think all of the things. So I'm an economist and I'm an engineer by training. I actually think, in some ways, and I think that's also what I find fascinating about our lecture series here, is that culture plays such an important part for our humanity and for our kind of well-being. And in some ways, economics and everything that we do is just to make our lives better and to allow us to afford our lives and to enjoy life, which is actually the arts in many ways, or music, or kind of things that make us happy. So I think that plays a very important role, I think, in all our lives, and the other things are just tools to make this possible. And it came in 2023. So it's been, I think, 2 great years. But funnily, I was here in 2005 when this lecture series was established. I was a student at UQ. And it was definitely a great place to be as a student, no question. I think also a place that I fell in love with, both Brisbane and Australia, for a number of different reasons. I think I really enjoyed, of course, as a student you enjoy many different things, but from a cultural perspective, what I enjoyed is a no worries life that kind of looks very positively into the future. That kind of believes that this country is actually quite a lucky country. In I did not know that term before and kind of how it's used or how it's abused, but it really felt like this. And I think the other thing that I found really fascinating is the multiculturalism that existed even then in 2005 already in Brisbane. So coming back in 2023, I was actually absolutely not only fascinated about this opportunity that the Griffith Asia Institute and Griffith University provided to me, but also to see how Brisbane and Australia became even more multicultural since 2005. So at least on the face of it, it was absolutely fascinating. Now, what I've found then always try to kind of get my head around it. What does this multiculturalism actually mean also for our engagement with the region? And so I'm German. I lived pretty much, except in Latin America, I lived on pretty much all continents. And so I came from Asia. I came from China, and I lived in kind of positions in Singapore and elsewhere. And it was very interesting that kind of despite this multiculturalism, I had the feeling that since 2005, actually, Australia has become less outward-looking and more inward-looking. And I can give you a very kind of, I think for me, very early experience. It was kind of 2 months after I arrived. There was a big conference organized by AIA, at the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And all that was talked about was AUKUS and how Australia needs to defend itself. And at the same time, most of my friends from kind of Singapore and the rest of Asia were in Singapore for a big conference. And everybody was talking about this massive opportunity that Asia is. And I found it very interesting. The Australian Institute of International Affairs should not only talk about defense and how we can protect ourselves against foreign influences, whereas Singapore, that was really open. And I think there's a lot of, opportunities that we particularly here kind of at the Asia Institute, and I think also in this audience, can bring to think about it, Asia as an opportunity and not as a threat. And that includes a number of different countries. And I think that also includes this whole understanding of kind of where do countries come from? Kind of they are older than us. How do we understand them? How do we listen to them? And not just kind of believe that kind of just because they might impact us differently, we need to be afraid of them. And I think this is really, a fantastic opportunity to think about us in Australia and to think kind of the new Asia, how is our place in this region. I also talked, of course, with a number of different Griffith University colleagues, and there was a lot of discussion on how I think our expertise and interest in language studies have decreased. And I think, again, this is an interesting development that I hope in some ways in our roles we can kind of open up our horizons about Asia rather than kind of, I think, being too afraid of what's happening in our region. And I think there's so many great opportunities.
So you've really touched there on the current complexity of the kind of strategic dynamics we're confronting. And I think those points around Australia, in some ways in retreat, that lens of national security overlaying so many of our conversations really resonates. And so I'd like to ask all of our panellists now for Act 3 to think forward. How do we work through this? And I think we are seeing some really fascinating dynamics, not just at that strategic space, but also where universities are facing particular challenges. Science, facts, knowledge are under attack in different ways. Cultural institutions are increasingly under pressure, if nothing else financially, as are universities. And cultural narratives are, really contested and increasingly difficult to sort of unpick and work and navigate, I guess. So looking ahead, Australia faces a region where intellectual and cultural exchange will become even more important for managing complex relationships, but where it's becoming seemingly ever more challenging. And we face a great change in ensuring that these kinds of spaces remain resilient and not vulnerable to some of those other political dynamics. So, Michael, I'd like to ask you, AsiaLink was mentioned previously, celebrating 30 years next week, I think, or this year at least. What's your assessment of our political and our cultural capability as a nation for taking on a more sophisticated, nuanced engagement role with Asia, for moving past that transactional and for unburying some of the things that have been buried along the way?
Well, mine's going to be a fairly pessimistic answer, I'm afraid, Caitlin. I think Australia has lost any sense of narrative or sense of purpose in relation to its neighbouring countries. I cannot, in my lifetime, remember a period like the one we're currently in, where there is just a complete loss of national imagination and narrative. Can
I push you on that, though? Because as Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, who spoke here as Shadow Foreign Minister, talks a lot of, she's talking a very big game in terms of our engagement, really pushing forward on our engagement with Southeast Asia, with the Pacific, building relationships, setting Australia as a trusted partner. Do you not think that that's actually translating into reality?
No, I don't. I mean, you go beneath Penny Wong's words and you question why. What is the imperative of all of this engagement? And there is no imperative. The imperative is fear of China, essentially. And it's utterly transparent in Southeast Asia. I have never seen in my lifetime a period in which Australia is less respected in Southeast Asia. And I was in Singapore at the start of last year, and the Singaporeans said to me, that I met with, said, we want the old Australia back. We want the Australia with a sense of purpose. The old Australia was irritating. They were at us with new ideas about every 5 years, and it was annoying, but it was kind of enjoyable, and you knew where Australia stood.
There was a bit of rough and tumble in the conversations that were happening, it seems.
This Australia tends to lecture Southeast Asia about Southeast Asia's relationship with China and with the United States and more generally. So, I mean, if you were to take a historic kind of, I can't think of another period in which Australia has had so little sense of purpose and vision for its relations with its Asian neighbours since probably the first 2 decades of the 20th century. and that vision is not going to come from government.
Okay.
I think, there were those of us, and I counted myself within it, that thought, well, when the Labor Party comes back to power, this was the same party that wrote the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper. For all of its flaws, there was a sense of vision behind that document. It's been dropped. It hasn't been mentioned again.
And the 2040 Southeast Asia Economic Strategy doesn't quite cut it?
Don't get me started.
Okay.
Well, it hasn't got off the starting line.
Yeah.
It hasn't worked. I mean, if you talk to people within government, they are despairing. They spent all of this time and effort on it, and the business community has not stepped up.
So let's then pick up on the cultural discourse. And Kelsey really beautifully just tried to give me a message on her phone, but doesn't realise I'm blind in every context. So I'm gathering that's a wind up. Okay. Julianne, you have been really thoughtful about thinking about cultural leadership mechanisms for improving our engagement. It's a topic that Jae Yung Lo, the founding director of the Centre for Asian Australian Leadership, addressed when he spoke here in May 2021. As the discourse that shapes our national identity and our values continues to evolve, how do we bring younger, more globally connected people into this conversation, and also our diaspora and our Asian Australian leaders?
And make them feel like they will be listened to and engaged with in an active way, not in a purely transactional way. Look, I mean, I'm a bit with Michael, I'm afraid. I feel a bit lacking in optimism about that capacity. But, I mean, you've got to remain hopeful that it can be done. And, I mean, the thing with Australia and its relationship with the region is that it's gone through phases, and it's come and gone, and Australia's played an active role and a more passive role. I mean, what we're doing now is, it's part of one of those phases, but I share Michael's view. So one of the things I was just sort of thinking about in terms of that is like the way in which international students are treated, which is very much as a transactional thing, like it's, they may get something out of it, they may not, they're here, they pay, they go, but the exchange back with the Australians is at best random, because they tend to be in their own, corralled into their own area. So that's a great loss. The lack of language teaching is just an extraordinary thing. I mean, when I was at high school in country Victoria in the very late 1960s, we had optional Indonesian language lessons every Tuesday and Thursday, and quite a lot of us went, what was Indonesia? I mean, people didn't travel, but somehow or other there was a sense that was something that was quite a good thing to do. My son-in-law was telling me last night that when he's 40-ish, that when he was at Scots College in Sydney, I guess it was he'd been born in the 80s, so it was early 90s, they did Indonesian. That was the language that was taught at school. He got moved to a different school. Oh, no, we don't do Indonesian, you do French here. And so now, I mean, how many places are there left teaching Indonesian? I mean, it's, I don't think there's many. So I think that sort of lack of paying attention to the sort of infrastructure, the sort of cultural infrastructure is really important. Michael mentions the Australia in the Asia Century report. And, he and I and various people all had discussions to say it's too transactional, it's too narrowly framed, it's too much about what we buy and sell, it's not about the values that we could bring to this, like the values that are implicit in the New Asia now, that we can bring uniquely to help, not to help, but to participate actively in a much more vibrant conversation. The thing that's most stunning about that is that when Tony Abbott became Prime Minister, he directed, or his office directed, that report should be made invisible. So the hard copies were all disappeared. It was taken off websites all around the place. One of the people who was involved in it joked to me recently and said the only place it remained on a website with a live link was in the Department of Defence, and their view was that they weren't quite capable of breaking a link, so it just stuck there by default. But that report, so by the time Abbott comes in 2015, that report, which the rest of us who'd been involved in a cultural thing of saying, look, talk about values, talk about the whole exchange, listen, not just talk. That even the very transactional sort of thing that was in the thing was made just something that wasn't part of government policy, just made invisible. So it's not surprising that 10 years on, it's hard to get the traction, because even the areas which were meant to be areas of strength, selling minerals, were reduced out of that discussion. So I think it's things like this gallery, it's things like Griffith University, it's things like the Asia Institute, it's, the Asia Links, all those various other activities that are around. And I think that the diaspora communities are actually really important to that as well. If they can be encouraged to actually exercise that sort of extra level of richness that their presence brings, rather than just being there as people who buy, sell houses, blah, blah, all the stuff that we're subjected to all the time.
I'd like to come to the audience for a couple of questions. Before I do, though, Christoph, can I turn to you for an optimistic view of...
I'm German.
And an engineer.
Exactly.
You can do this. How are you thinking we might reimagine Perspectives Asia? We might think about our engagement through the Griffith Asia Institute differently to have that kind of transformative impact. What is your strategic outlook?
Oh, God, I think it's a great question. So I think positively, I think there's a lot of opportunities with the youth. I mean, I'm looking here at the audience and it's beautiful, but I wish there would be also a lot more younger people that are actually joining us. So I think we have to do something to also reach a lot more younger people, to excite them about Asia and perspectives from Asia. I think there is a lot of opportunities for us, particularly, that are not, for example, in Canberra, to think about Asia much more contextually. And here's a shout out to Bruce. I think Australia is very good at looking even at countries bilaterally. So what's our relationship with Indonesia? What's our relationship with China? But actually there's a kind of a contextual understanding that is necessary if you want to really successfully engage with our partners and kind of be part of the region. And I think this is an opportunity for us too. And I'm really excited about this, about building these bridges, about kind of, I think, bringing people here to Brisbane as well, and I think using this opportunity. And I think what's great is that we have the opportunity to rethink economy. I'm an economist. I think economy is important, as I said, but Australia's carrot of economic integration with Asia is very, very little. Like, honestly, most of the Asian countries don't care about kind of opening more trade with Australia. Yes, it's good. But actually, who are your biggest trading partners are very different trading partners. It's India, Indonesia, China, and Japan is much bigger. So Australia does not have so much to offer in terms of trade. But what are the other things that we can actually offer to kind of bring people together and share our vision also for the region? And I think these are actually really great opportunities. And Brisbane has an opportunity with Brisbane 32. So I think there's, not only don't be so German and so negative, Julianne. Be Australian and say no worries, everything's going to be good.
And it might
that's how I believe Australians are.
That's right, and it might yet be, because there is an energy and there's a capacity. I just think in a way it's about planting the seeds of possibility and making people feel a bit confident that can be achieved. I mean, it's been interesting for me just to think about that, because I've been involved in making this TV series, which is involved in looking at some of the historical patterns of Australian life. But what we've tried to emphasise is the moments when things changed, when just you can actually push it a bit and suddenly, that happened. Oh, well, actually, we could be a bit optimistic about this. If we just push this, you never know, something else might happen. So I think it's about sharing with people and making available to people a sense of how those things, those seeds get sown and they flower later, rather than saying, it's all hopeless, we can't do anything about it. Actually, we can.
And I think if I can just add to it.
I can be German. I can out-German you.
I think also kind of, since I'm looking at economy, I think there is so much great economic opportunity around Asia where Australia can benefit much more from kind of compared to what it does. Our kind of belief is, for the last years, mining and particularly fossil fuel, carbon intense exports is great. And actually, there's all these opportunities for Australia in particular to also look at low carbon exports. And this actually can kind of be such a kind of make things possible that we don't think were absolutely possible before. And this is, again, I think, a really exciting opportunity. And our trade is with Asia and not with Europe so much, or not with the US so much. It's Asia. And I think there's a lot of dynamic, which is very exciting.
And Chris,
I thought you
this is your moment.
because I wanted to get onto this future pathway
Yes,
question,
yeah,
which
yes.
you posed to all of us. And I feel that I'm a bit like Michael in the sense that I feel we've lost our way and we've lost a lot of ground over the last 20 years, particularly in relation to soft diplomacy. It's kind of a key theme for me because I'm ambitious for this gallery and I'm opportunistic about where I go to find support for it. And one of the places we've gone to since the birth of the APT is DFAT.
Yep.
And the Commonwealth a bit, but I know it's part of the Commonwealth, but sometimes Office of the Arts, but most often DFAT. And we've become kind of cultural ambassadors into the region, into countries that most cultural institutions like ours never, ever tread. We're going to places where people are saying, you're the first curator from a Western museum we've ever met. Welcome. And Ruth's pioneering that work in the Pacific. Tarun and Ruben and the team are doing it all across Asia. And I just feel that this is something that is what gives us traction. We recently got an amazing big grant from the Australia-India Relationship Council. And that grant is getting us working in tandem with a museum called the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore. And we're going to be working on a series of amazing oleographs which we've acquired, which have got beautiful hand-stitched embroidery on them, put there not by the artist but by the proud owner of that particular work. And we're doing conservation research and a digital story and so on, and we're doing it with Indian colleagues. So I did want to mention that one way I think we can turn this boat around, because it's sinking as far as I'm concerned, $456,000 is all that the diplomacy grants amount to that come out of the Australian DFAT. It's just
Pathetic.
rubbish. And we need to do better. And I think what we do is we get all the like-minded high commissioners and ambassadors around the country, and there's a lot of them, and I'm going to name a few of them. The Australian High Commissioner to India, the representative of the Australian office in Taipei, the Australian High Commissioner to Singapore, the Australian Ambassador to Japan, and the Australian High Commissioner to PNG. I know them all. They're amazing, arts-interested, switched-on people that want to work with us in any way they possibly can. Get them to talk to their government about the value and importance of actually making things happen culturally between countries, because all of the 5 of them are amazing at it. And then you go to other countries where it's just a box tick, right? But use your allies as your champions. Invite Penny Wong and Tony Burke to sit on this platform when we're in the bigger theatre again and get them to talk about the value and the challenge of providing stronger investment in cultural diplomacy. Because if they don't, this whole game will sink without trace. And I really fear for that. So my last thought is, we have a new Colombo plan. It's amazing. The old Colombo plan was one of the best things Australia ever invested in. Imagine if we revived the level of Asia-linked grants for residencies that used to be overseen by Dr. Alison Carroll, and we called it part of the Cultural Colombo plan.
Yeah.
You know, I'm putting it on the table.
You are on fire.
And my last one is, I've only got one more. This is why I was bursting to get it out. The bloody Olympics.
Yes.
We've got
Okay,
them
tell
whether
us.
we want them or we don't.
Yep.
What's the thing that nobody knows about? The Games for Oceania.
Yep.
That's this game. It's not out in Fiji. That's the game. Use that as a levering opportunity to blow everything up with our relationships with Pacific peoples and really bring them closest to us. And how do they most want to connect with us? Actually, through culture. So they're my quick
Chris,
ideas.
you heard it here, folks, and I think that's just brilliant. And actually, can I take one of your ideas a little bit further? And I think we need to make sure all of the new Colombo scholars who have returned and are in Brisbane are coming to these and helping us curate some of these discussions as well. But let me turn very quickly to the audience, and I am sorry, there's so much we could talk about. Do we have any questions? Oh, there's a microphone coming to you from one of our fabulous business school students.
The institution that's not been mentioned that can be harnessed, perhaps with the representatives of the panel, is the Australian media. So one wants to learn about Asia. You go to London, for example, the Financial Times. Want to go to Asia, you have to go to America, believe it or not, to Princeton or other institutions that write about these things, that promote these things. But you come to Australia, and I don't know any of the media in Australia For example, the Financial Review, which is a fairly serious newspaper, does not have representatives, reporters, as far as I know, in Asia, perhaps with the exception of Beijing. But the Australian media doesn't have that. They go to London, they go to Washington, but they don't report about Asia.
I might throw that to you, Julianne.
Yeah. And they used to. I mean, there used to be more reporters based in Asia. I mean, it's what's happened with the collapse of the sort of economic model of the mainstream media that they've cut those appointments. But you see it also with the ABC. I mean, the ABC used to have many more correspondents based through the region. I mean, you talk about the small amount of grant money that's available. I mean, that spectacular own goal of when the ABC Asia Pacific was killed, and I remember people in DFAT saying, oh, it's all right, the money will go back to other areas of cultural diplomacy. It didn't. It went back to consolidated revenue, straight back. There wasn't the $25 million over 5 years that was meant to have been used for that activity. So I think it's the public broadcasters, they've got sympathetic government now, in terms of funding them. That's something which is an area, they were doing their bits and pieces of international broadcasting. I mean, that's something that really should be, people should be putting pressure on them to increase that network of foreign correspondents at least. I mean, the Australian media, I mean, the leading so many of the leading commentators got captured by the anti-China, the China Threat Brigade. I remember when the Sydney Morning Herald did that front page when they were, at their peak of channeling the anti-China stuff. And it was like a replica of the 1905, images or the pre-Federation images of the red arrows coming down from China, or that got repeated in the Vietnam War and so on. But there it was again. I mean, the front page actually looked like a modern-day version of the fear and threat of China. So I think it's a matter of, and through organisations like, universities like this, of training up a new generation of people who can write persuasively and convincingly and knowledgeably so that they can challenge some of those people who are holding those very narrow sort of worldviews in those positions of power.
Thank you. Any others? Samit, if that is you, I think that's you. I'm clearly not blind when it comes to very far away.
I'm quite distinctive, Caitlin. Thank you all. That was rousing and brilliant. I completely agree with the kind of diagnosis of Australia's kind of receding outlook towards the region and this transactional sense of external relations. But I think that's also intimately connected with a transactional sense of self that's kind of been festering in Australia for a long time. And I'm just wondering how if you kind of agree with that, then how do we keep both of those problems in frame, given that they are so deeply connected?
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at Kelsey. Who would like to pick that? Michael?
Can you, sorry, I didn't quite follow your question. Which two perspectives?
Like a transactional sense of external relations, but I think that's related to an increasingly transactional sense of ourselves, right? So what qualifies as us? We can see that in, growing inequalities,
Right.
Sort of racialised discourses about inclusion. How do we address both of the inward problem and the outward problem?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. Look, what I would say is I think those years of the China boom for Australia between 2000 and probably 2015 or so, when Australia got enormously wealthy from the Chinese boom, we managed to avoid all of those financial crises because we were so closely sort of tied into China. I think we'll look back and say something actually changed in Australia during that period, and that Australians developed a different sense of themselves in relation to each other. I think our election campaigns during that time became much less about what was good for the country and what was good for me personally. I think we sort of personalised and weaponised, policy, public policy in Australia, which is partly why reform has completely died within Australia. I've got to say, I go back to political leadership. You know, I think what Australia needs is a new generation of political leaders who aren't the sort of transactional politicians that we have all across our parliament at the moment.
Can I ask, given Parliament has just convened for under this parliamentary term, and we have quite a different look in that Parliament, does that give you any reassurance?
Not really.
I'm really trying. I'm so trying to, you know.
Kate, can I just
Pick
chip
up
in on
on
that?
that,
I mean,
absolutely.
It's very interesting. I mean, one of the, you know, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the promise of federation, because federation tends to get dismissed as, oh, it's just boring. It was just, you know, greybeards deciding what was going to happen. In fact, on the ground, what was happening during those debates was an enormously vibrant discussion, you know, discussions about, will we be a republic? You know, why is there, you know, what sort of deals do we need to do? You know, what sort of rights should be included? I mean, it didn't get reflected in the document that passed the British Parliament as the Constitution of Australia. But on the ground, there was a lot happening. And it seems to me that trying to reactivate some of that sort of energy, you know, that people don't know about, in a way that gives people a way to think about the country now is actually quite important. And I think that one of the things that's happened with the sort of the independence movements and the sort of community-based activism is that there's a possibility of that sort of granular discussion happening in a way that's not going to get immediately filtered up into the major political parties. So one of the things that I think is quite telling is the monument to federation, which sits in Centennial Park, and nobody knows what it is because it was designed to be mysterious. So there is no sign that tells you that it is a monument to federation, except etched in the sandstone around the dome is a question: will Australia be an Eden of the future or a place of mammon? That I've got it wrong. But they're the two things. It's a polarity. Will it be a civilization of the future or a place just consumed with personal gain and avarice? And, you know, like, well, you can tell where we are at the moment. But I think that debate has always been there to various degrees, but it's not necessarily reflected up through the official channels. So trying to find ways, and galleries are important in that, education's important in that, and the media is important in that. Trying to find ways to reactivate that, I think, is really crucial, but people have to be actively having that conversation. The thing that worries me more than the banality of the Parliament is that it feels to me that in a structural sense, the economy that we're now entering is so transactional. It's so limited by the reduction of everything you do to what can be reduced to an AI, yes, no, this will happen, the data says this, the data says that, therefore we can't do it. That to break out of it when the superstructure of our lives is so intimately transactional, it's harder, I think, than it's probably ever been. So, sorry, I'm going to try and be up. Positive. Yeah, but we can do it.
I think kind of just to add to that, and I think kind of tying into what we said before, what is it kind of, how do we become less transactional? By having a joint purpose. And I think to our point before is kind of what is the joint purpose that we're pursuing? And I think particularly it's not only the media, I would say, to your point, it's a lot of social media. People just want instant gratification and kind of instant feedback. There is no patience. So I think kind of there is kind of, it's not an Australian problem. I think it's a global problem. But I think having a joint purpose, and the joint purpose doesn't have to be negative. The crises are often a good joint purpose. It doesn't have to be a crisis. It can also be something positive that we can work towards. And that's where leadership, I think, is important.
Yeah. And I think that your point earlier, and Michael's as well, you know, about the inward looking and the outward looking, you know, that's been a dynamic. You know, at times Australia's been outward looking and at times it's been inward looking, you know, and whether the Trump breaking of the rules of the old order triggers a bit more confidence in saying, actually, we're going to look outward to a whole bunch of different places in a bilateral sense rather than focusing everything on one, there's a possibility of that.
And George Megalogenis makes that point, I think, and I'm not sure where he's made it, but I know I've read it, about this constant tension, retreat and engagement, inward, outward, and actually trying to build the confidence within an Australian society to think outward. Chris, I'm going to come back to you because this is something, you've already talked about it, but you haven't mentioned the work that might be going even further afield from this institution.
We are planning to take a small account of our Asia Pacific collection to London in May next year to show at the V&A Museum, which we're very excited about. But thank you for the plug. But what I did want to say, just picking up the joint purpose sort of injunction we just got there from Christoph, I think thinking back, because I've read a bit of backstory about the lectures and everything that's contributed to this, 151 lectures over all of those 20 years, is that we've really maintained a very strong joint purpose. But we often do it by galvanising around an exciting speaker or a group of people on a panel or something. But maybe this is also a time, while we take stock of the last 20 years, to think about if there are other things we could do in this forum that are not just that. Because the parade of people that have come over this stage in the years, and for me it was Michael Kirby.
Right.
Oh, what an extraordinary Australian, and what an extraordinary account of that research he did into North Korea, mostly from people that have been smuggled out or somehow left. But there are moments like that this group, Perspectives Asia, have delivered, and I feel really excited by the challenge because, Michael's such a downer, that what we could do is we could think toward what the next 20 years might be able to achieve. Because we haven't achieved much on, let's call it, the cultural diplomacy front, where we're starting from scratch almost. But on other fronts, we might be able to achieve more. And I think it's a really good thing for us to think about and talk about as a team, Griffith Asia Institute and ourselves at ACAPA, about what that might look like in the next so many years. We might be able to do things that could even introduce a cornerstone kind of idea that we can bring in a great speaker to chip away at once a year or something. I don't know. I think it'd be great to build an even better monument to this great partnership than just the fabulous people that have passed this stage.
And before we finish, I wonder if I could ask our speakers,
So many good ideas today.
if you, in addition to that, Chris, and thank you, because I did want to ask, is there a favourite moment that you've seen over the last 20 years? I'm going to talk about one, and that was when Sue Travaskis, another very influential person within the Griffith Asia Institute sphere, stood in for one of our speakers at very short notice. I think we got a call in the morning that Linda Jiven had dislocated her knee and couldn't be here to talk about the topic, is China taking over the world? And Sue Travaskis, who is a good friend of Linda's, stood here so admirably and opened by saying, if Linda was standing here, you need to know what Linda's like. She has purple hair. She's an extrovert. She's written this fabulous piece. I'm not those things, but I have her speech. And she delivered it beautifully, much like I remember Michael Kirby, striding across the stage and having us all enthralled. Are there any moments that stand out for you?
Well, I remember one that I was involved in which must have been after the Simon Green short-lived cultural policy came out, and we had Wesley Enoch and a couple of other people, and I remember Wesley just speaking absolutely brilliantly, as he does, and so I sort of, he's a standout for me, but I sort of feel for him that he's now got the job of repairing the damaged cultural sector as chair of the Creative Australia. And so it's sort of like, it's a sort of, hospital pass, I suspect, but if anyone can do it, he can.
And someone we might bring back.
Yeah.
Michael?
Look, probably for me it was Sean Dorney.
Yep.
Sean was really quite affected by that terrible illness that finally took him. But there was something about when, he was obviously very debilitated when he came up to the lectern, but as he started speaking about the Pacific, you could just see the spirit come through, and it was such an electrifying speech. So that would be the one for me.
My history is much shorter. I would go with a kind of, when we had a panel here about the CIS exhibition, which was absolutely fun, it was entertaining, and you really kind of learned about the creation and of art. And then the kind of the moments that arts are created are so spontaneous and so wonderful. And so I really enjoyed that discussion that we had here. Yeah.
So I think we've harnessed a few themes around passion, energy, fun, and really re-enlivening the conversations here for the next 2 decades. And I wonder, Simon, if on that note, I could ask you to give a vote of thanks to our speakers. And while Simon is making his way to the podium, please join me in a round of applause.
Well, thanks everybody. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you. What a fantastic and privilege it is to listen to these great people talking about the experiences that they've had. And this is a celebration of 20 years of fantastic speakers and work between an art gallery and a university. And I say art gallery and university because maybe that's the positive and the negative, the pessimism and the optimism that comes into the conversation that we've just listened to, which is, I think, really exciting. And I think, it's very difficult to recap all the various elements that we've been privileged to hear, but obviously we've been talking about Asia and Australia, that opening and closing that we're very familiar with. We've talked about the word transactional was used, I think, the most used word of the day, and of course there's a reason for that because that's the age in which we live in. But also the importance of that human and cultural understanding and learning together and being part of a region and that we know about. And we talked about the notions of fear and friend and trying to bring that together. So we managed to talk a huge amount, thank you to the very, as Caroline said, the good, the great and the informed as people that are down here. But I think there's a few things to hang on to before we leave. When we're celebrating 20 years, and I don't know where the birthday cake's coming, but, I imagine it's soon. But, there's so many things to celebrate. We talked about the Asia-Pacific Triennial being, going into its 12th year, the 12th edition, rather, coming forward. We're talking about this forum being in its 20th year. Griffith University itself celebrates 50 years. And I remember being a student at Griffith University, and I remember right from the very early days, I think I was there in year 5 of the university, there was this school called Modern Asian Studies, and people like Colin McCarris were absolutely huge figures within that university. And I'm sure there are many colleagues here that remember Colin and what he did, and that morphed into the Centre for Studies of Australian and Asian Relations, CSER, strange name. And, people like Nancy Viviani got together with people who and wrote publications and approached to people who had a generation of Australians who had been in post-war or in wartime in Asia and having their experiences recorded and bringing those experiences back to Australia. And indeed approached my father, who was a doctor, and printed this book, and it was number 14 and the series went on to 19. Extraordinary kind of things that we have done and continue to do. Griffith Institute, Great Asia Institute, continues to flourish to this day. Queensland Art Gallery is, started in 1895. The APT has been part of, it really put it on the map in terms of world. So there is so many things to really be thankful for, even though our relationship and our interest in Asia is a curious thing. We have really stuck to it, and this forum is really a great landmark for that. So I think there is optimism, and I'm sure everyone knows that. And Michael, and saying the word listening, how good is that? Caitlin's in a happy place, another place thing. So fantastic. So let me just finish by thanking so much our speakers individually. Of course, the talented moderator, Professor Caitlin Byrne, Chris Saines, our director, Professor Christoph Netterfield, of course, and Michael Wesley, and Professor Julianne Schultz. Thank you so much. And of course, Vice Chancellor, Professor Caroline Evans. All thank you to you. If we could give them a round of applause. And lastly, as you leave, I'd like to thank all the people that make this happen. So obviously it's a team effort, but we're very grateful for that. And we'll welcome you, and please thank you for coming and supporting this fantastic Perspectives Asia for the 20th year.